I'm Jarrett Murphy from City Limits.
I'm Ben Max from Gotham Gazette.
Hundreds of candidates will try to convince millions of voters they have the skills and solutions to get New York City through the COVID-19 crisis,
Navigate our economic problems.
address racism, crime, climate change, traffic, transit, and more.
The issues won't just define the campaign and the race, they'll shape the future of the city we live in.
And that's why City Limits and Gotham Gazette are teaming up to bring you video briefings on the most important issues of 2021.
In each one, we'll map out a major issue, give you important background information, and offer key questions for the candidates to help you get answers and decide how to cast your vote.
Check out gothamgazette.com or citylimits.org to follow the series.
And remember to check out the Max and Murphy podcast every week, including live interviews on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. on WBAI radio.
Most important, don't forget to register and to vote. The primaries are in June and key deadlines are even sooner.
I'm Ben Max from Gotham Gazette.
And I'm Jarrett Murphy from City Limits. Today, we're talking about policing and criminal justice, likely to be among the top issues in the 2021 election discussion. And candidates will be expected to make their views and reform plans clear over the next few months.
Yeah, I mean, it's, possibly the top issue for many voters is what are candidates going to do about police reform? And for many voters who think about a different direction, what are candidates going to do to bring crime down, especially after we've seen a significant rise in shootings and murders in 2020. And then there's many voters, I think, that want to know both. What are you going to do to make policing fair, more racially just, increase police discipline and accountability, while also making the city safer? And that's where questions around the role of the NYPD and of policing, comes into question. And we're seeing that discussion in the mayoral race and other races already as to what powers should police officers have and what responsibilities should they have? What should the size of the police force be? And many other questions.
And, let's be honest, this is not the first time candidates running for mayor or city council or any of the other offices we're talking about have discussed policing. It's a major function of municipal government. It was a big part of the Ed Koch campaign in 77, Giuliani and Dinkins talking in 89 and 93. And of course, in 2013, Bill de Blasio. In that campaign, it was really about reforming the police department, changing stop and frisk. The mayor promised that. He achieved that to some degree. He disappointed a lot of people with the timidity of some of his reforms from the outset, with Bill Bratton as his commissioner, embracing broken windows before moving away from it. And obviously, over the past year, you've had this fascinating and in some ways tragic dimension of the topic, the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, continued questions about policing here in the city, touching off major protests, how those protests themselves were policed, the movement to defund the police here with some limited success in the most recent city budget. All of that playing out against rising crime means that this year you have something interesting, a campaign where candidates should be talking about both how to reform policing and how to address crime. Usually we've had one element of the conversation. This year we'll have to have both.
Right. And let's certainly be clear that one of the reasons that the Black Lives Matter protests that we saw in the spring and summer of 2020 were so intense in New York City was because the killing of George Floyd reminded people so much of the killing of Eric Garner in 2014, and really, raised questions about other killings of individuals, very often people of color, very often Black men, around discipline for the officers involved, and around questions of how Bill de Blasio, who was elected as a police reformer, has or hasn't lived up to those promises. And one of the most important things, I think, for mayoral candidates in 2021, especially on the Democratic side, is looking at Bill de Blasio's morality and saying, hold on, everybody from sort of far to his left or just a little bit to his left are disappointed that he hasn't been more of a reformer. And so many people to his right, moderates, conservatives, feel like he's been totally anti-police, and, trying to learn some lessons from this mayoralty around how do you lead the police department? How do you bring about significant reform? And how do you, make the city feel like you're on top of issues related to crime and public safety? And, Bill de Blasio has really struggled on all of the above. And this is important for mayoral candidates and candidates for other offices too, to really be thinking about and explaining to voters what their vision is for a fair policing of the city, and also to keep the city safe. And as I said earlier, that's where some of that conversation can extend beyond the police department around the discussion of public safety. And that's where we saw in 2020 this conversation of, what should the police department budget be? Should there be a defunding of the police? If so, to what degree? What should the head count of the NYPD be? And so many of those other discussions that candidates for office in 2021 really need to have thought about and be telling voters where they stand.
And I think one of the complications, and this is moving from sort of why the issue is important this year to how it should actually be discussed and how it will be governed in 2022 and beyond. It's really more than the police department. It's really more than how you react to crime. All those are immensely complex issues, as you mentioned: police accountability, the number of cops we have, what their role is, but also this ties very intricately with the court system, bail laws, discovery rules, sentencing procedures, and also with the correction system. And that's been a refrain in recent years all around the country, but especially in New York. The kind of cruelty of incarceration, especially the problems in Rikers Island, the mayor embracing the closure of Rikers, the opening of borough jails, still a controversial idea, an idea that's been set back in terms of the actual construction because of the COVID-19 crisis. Something the next mayor will have to deal with is making decisions around building those structures and actually moving people to them, shutting down Rikers, and how to deal with the continuing problem of violence in the jails. And I think one thing that goes to, Ben, is that we tend to focus, for good reason, on the mayoral candidates when we're talking about policing and crime and criminal justice. But there are a lot of other players at the table, some of whom will also be on the ballot come June and November.
Right. I mean, the city controller has oversight of the budget, also has a hand in, police involved settlements and other city settlements that often occur, and can sometimes go around the mayoral administration on that. There's obviously the role of the city council in determining the city's budget. And this is one of the most important things we saw in 2020 around that defunding the NYPD conversation and city budget conversation, which turned out to be even more complex than a lot of people thought going in, because you wound up having legislators of color who did not buy into the significant defunding of the NYPD that some activists, including many activists of color, were calling from. And some of those very activists of color who were in the defund the NYPD movement in 2020 are running for office, for city council offices here in 2021. And they're also trying to influence, of course, the citywide races. So a lot of confluence there. The city council's role also in oversight and in legislating, deeply important in terms of how policing is done. The mayor will always have a lot of control over the police department and what policing looks like in the city, but the city council's role shouldn't be overlooked, as well as the state legislature, which can, of course, set statewide law that the city then has to abide by. And then there's other entities as well.
Right. I mean, obviously the district attorneys, and two of them are up for election this year. They play a huge role in how prosecution goes forward, and obviously that affects policing. You've got the court system, you've got the unions, editorial boards, obviously a lot of players at the table. And what it indicates is the mayor has tremendous power, but has to figure out how to work that with the others who are also on the board.
The Civilian Complaint Review Board, we should mention, which is not elected, although some people want it to be, which is this, quasi-independent mayoral appointed entity for the most part. And there are questions in this election cycle about what the powers of the Civilian Complaint Review Board should be, and how much a police commissioner should have to listen to the recommendations for officer discipline from the Civilian Complaint Review Board. Among the many questions that we need to hear mayoral and other candidates answer is, what do you think the role of the CCRB should be, and how much should the police commissioner have to listen to those recommendations?
And is the NYPD, actually controlled by the commissioner, is a more deep and frightening question that some have raised during the de Blasio years. But we now have this huge field running to replace Mayor de Blasio, and therefore have at least tacit control over the police department. Obviously more candidates that we can talk about during the time we have here, and each of them has a slightly different slice at the apple. But as the field has coalesced so far, it does seem possible to kind of divide people up into like, say, three different lanes in terms of their approach to policing?
I think so. And I think, that gets at one thing that we've talked about and that I've been thinking about, which is that, very often the discussions around Democratic candidates for any office are boiling down to this sort of progressive versus moderate discussion. And it's not always that clean cut. And as you just got it, I think there's more like three lanes emerging, at least on policing, and I think on other issues as well. I think in the furthest left lane, you have candidates like Carlos Menchaca, Diane Morales, really trying to put forward much more of a real re-envisioning of policing and how public safety is done. Maya Wiley might be sort of close to that lane, but maybe in the one that's a little bit more moderate and, thinking a lot about reform, but also, not necessarily sort of wholesale or as much defunding of the NYPD as some others might be. I would also say Scott Stringer, Sean Donovan are probably in that sort of middle lane that's pretty progressive, but not quite as further left. And then you have the sort of progressive to moderate lane where you have candidates like Catherine Garcia, you have Zach Iskell, you have Lori Sutton, and you certainly have, I think, Ray McGuire and Eric Adams both talking about their personal experiences as Black men, but also Eric Adams has personal experience in the NYPD for decades, and he is really trying to put forward this combined platform of police reform and fighting crime in a fairly moderate way. But if you listen to him talk, he thinks that a lot of change is needed at the NYPD. So it's very complicated. There's a lot of candidates. I didn't even get to them all. And there's also, of course, questions around whether people actually have the understanding of how the police department works and the management skills to put their visions into effect.
So a lot of candidates, a very complex issue. Let's boil it down to the most important questions that we feel candidates should have to answer before primary day, before election day in November. One of the top ones, obviously, is who or what type of person or what kind of philosophy do you want to have as your police commissioner? Because that person is going to have tremendous power in shaping policing and law and order in the city. That's certainly one. What are some others?
Well, I also think about, we have seen a significant increase in gun violence in 2020. The numbers are still, relatively what they were maybe a decade ago. So, things haven't plunged back into some of the scary, bad old days that some people say. But I think the question around what's your sort of big vision for reducing gun violence and reducing crime in the city and how you execute it in a fair way is another big one.
Obviously, another one, whether the new commissioner will be able to overrule the Civilian Complaint Review Board when it comes to officer discipline. Commissioners traditionally have, much to the ire of advocates in the CCRB itself. That's a big policy question for mayoral candidates to answer. And of course, getting back to the city's jails, smaller population, rising violence. What will the city do to correct that? I think that's something candidates need to be pressed on as well. Obviously, a lot to discuss between now and the election, but it's important for people to be prepared to participate in that. So if you are listening, if you are watching, make sure you check your voter registration or register to vote at vote.nyc.
And be sure to read at gothamgazette.com and citylimits.org as we cover the mayoral race and many other races here in 2021.
Hi, I'm Jarrett Murphy from City Limits.
And this is Ben Max from Gotham Gazette. This week, we're looking at the issues of climate change and resiliency and how the city's candidates in the 2021 elections, especially those running for mayor, are addressing these issues. 3 serious candidates for mayor have already released detailed plans related to climate and resiliency, and we're expecting more. Candidates for other offices are also, of course, talking about the issue. And it seems like how New York City approaches climate change and resiliency is going to be a major focus of the 2021 campaign in a way it hasn't really been before.
Right. I mean, so many of the issues, Ben, that we talk about in this race and others are ones you could have predicted since like the 1920s. We're going to talk about crime. We're going to talk about jobs, about schools, about traffic. This is an issue that, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have discussed. Obviously, Mayor Bloomberg pushed by some advocates and pushed by facts on the ground, began to make it a part of the city's sort of active policy discussion with Plan YC, which came out in early 2007. Of course, Superstorm Sandy made it very clear just how real the risk is and how real our vulnerabilities are. Mayor de Blasio came into office with really very little record as an environmentalist. I think people were generally impressed or pleasantly surprised by what got done during his term, both at his leadership and those of the council as well. Some strong environmental leaders there, certainly. But in terms of efforts to make the city greener, to cut down on emissions, to set some pretty ambitious goals, the latest one being reduction of emissions by 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050, with some early benchmarks for that, especially for city buildings occurring as early as 2024. So that is what's already on the table. That's what the next mayor will be have to implement. But obviously, I think there is a lot of pressure to do more.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because when Superstorm Sandy hit in 2012, it sort of set the stage in part for that mayoral race that happened in 2012 and really into 2013. And yet this issue still was not sort of in the top tier of issues. And we'll see, because of how often people, think about climate change, think about resiliency. They don't often think about it as sort of part of day-to-day life, even though there's many that do, and many activists on the subject and advocates try to point out that this is an everyday issue now, and it's a year-round issue, and it's not just about the next big storm. But it wasn't so much a part of the 2013 conversation, and now that we get into 2021, it seems like it will be more so. But let's talk about what we're really talking about here when we talk about candidates for office and government addressing climate change and resiliency. There's a lot of different elements to that I think, often people who aren't paying close attention all the time, it just sort of, the world is getting warmer and there's bigger storms, and it's a big problem, but there's a lot of different buckets to pull apart when we talk about how candidates and how government address these issues.
Well, totally. I think one of them you've sort of alluded to is that, it's about obviously how the city handles its own role as a greenhouse gas producer. New York City, for the density we have here, we obviously are more efficient than many places, but buildings still contribute mightily to emissions. Obviously, our transportation sector to some degree, to a lesser extent, industrial. But what's the city done and what's it's doing to reduce its emissions, to reduce its greenhouse gas, its climate footprint, its carbon footprint, and how does it achieve those measures?
Right, and that's both in terms of how the city's contributing to like the larger global warming and climate change, but also that has a lot to do with the air quality in the city and in certain neighborhoods all the time. And that's where we've seen, things that are, climate related measures, like how the trash is picked up, the recent reforms in the city around commercial waste disposal and trying to limit the number of truck miles on the streets. Those things are all part of this conversation, in terms of what the air quality is in the city and how, what the vehicles are that the city uses, and other regulations that the city controls.
Right. And so that's the emission side. And then the other side of climate change is, frankly, as Sandy and other events since then around the country and here have illustrated, climate change is already here. The effects are being felt. They will intensify over coming years, regardless of what the world does to reduce emissions. Just a question of how bad they'll get, but they are here. And so how is the city shoring up resiliency? So you have that emissions versus resiliency, building up the coast, figuring out how to harden properties, how to remove perhaps people from some properties. That's a kind of big lens to keep in mind as people look at what candidates are saying on climate change. Another factor in that is you're obviously talking about the city as an actor. The city has plenty of buildings, lots of vehicles. What is it doing to reduce its footprint? And then you have what's going on in private property. And that goes to the resiliency question too. One of the issues to this point has been you have a lot of private properties along the waterfront, small properties in some cases. How do you get them to be more resilient, to be elevated, to be hardened against the elements?
And to encourage them to move.
Right.
That part of that conversation about retreat from the coastline, was a tricky one after Sandy, and it continues to be a tricky one. I just wanted to make a couple of points. One is that, when we are talking about emissions, you hit on the two biggest issues in New York City, which is buildings and transit. And so those are the two big buckets of emissions to keep in mind. As you got at, there's also some manufacturing, industrial, that's important to note. On the resiliency front, we're not going to get into all the details here. We're trying to keep these video briefings fairly brief. But there's a huge list of resiliency projects that the city has announced over the last, let's say, decade, including under Bloomberg, including under de Blasio, that have moved extremely slowly. And these are projects, again, as you said, to deal with the current and upcoming impacts of climate change, even while the city is trying to take measures to reduce emissions, go green, go renewable. And those projects really need a mayor and a city council and other elected officials to really focus on them and push them ahead. And that's got to be one of the biggest conversation points in this election. The other thing I wanted to mention is, there's a lot of talk about what is a Green New Deal. There's the federal Green New Deal. Some at the state level have talked about, what's a New York Green New Deal. And then there's like New York City Green New Deal. And a lot of what we're talking about is reducing emissions, but also this sort of transition into a renewable electricity sector, renewable energy, and the jobs that come along with that.
Right. I mean, that's one of the fascinating things with the issue is that it's so linked to other issues in the city. I mean, jobs, racial equity, what we do with our waste, how we handle our streetscape and like open space. And that's why it ties in, I think, interestingly to the conversation going on in the city council about comprehensive planning. It'd be hard to have comprehensive planning without a strong climate lens. And also public housing, which has obviously been a big topic of itself for recent years and for a long time. A lot of public housing is uniquely vulnerable to the effects of climate change because of where it is geographically and because of the conditions of those buildings physically. So it really is kind of a meta issue, an Uber issue that brings a lot of different topics together, and it brings a lot of players together. I mean, our focus, as always, is on the mayor's race, but as you mentioned at the top, a lot of candidates are talking about climate change, candidates for comptroller and city council as well. But this clearly is an issue that also involves the state and the governor, and they have combined in 2019 to create a much higher standard, a much higher goal for New York State to reduce emissions. And they also have something to say about resiliency. The state buyout program after Hurricane Sandy was much more extensive than anything the city has done and is something that might be a model for what's going forward. And obviously, and we say this recording it on the eve of the Biden administration, the federal role is huge, both in terms of will there be a national commitment to reducing emissions so that New York City doesn't have to worry about any kind of competitive issues with other areas if it has stricter rules? And on the resiliency front, particularly for New York City, the Army Corps of Engineers, its study of the New York Harbor and ways to potentially mitigate storm surge, a controversial study, but an important one that was shut down last year by the Trump administration. People are hoping it's resumed this year, but that is a very big piece of the puzzle in terms of resiliency in the city.
Yeah, I think you framed that really well. And as you mentioned, the discussion around climate change and resiliency is happening in other races. The city council will play a big role. So individual city council races are important here. As we've seen in the last several years, the city council has at times really driven the discussion on legislation around shifting the city's emissions and this big new law that passed with the mayor's support around trying to green the city's buildings and insist on new regulations around new buildings and even retrofitting many of the city's largest buildings. So a lot there, but also the race for controller. The current controller, Scott Stringer, who's running for mayor, worked with the current mayor and others to try to divest city pension funds. That's still in process. It's unclear exactly where that's going to land in terms of the end result. But divesting city pension fund dollars from the major fossil fuel companies, that's an issue to watch. How the controller candidates in this election talk about that plan and the path forward on that they'll inherit is important. And then I also wanted to give people just a few more planks of sort of the specifics that people are talking about. There's this question around whether the city will be home to fossil fuel infrastructure, pipelines, et cetera. There's the question of creating a public utility. There are issues around, as you mentioned, NYCHA, what to do about kind of greening NYCHA's infrastructure, greening NYCHA's energy, putting green roofs on all NYCHA buildings. Again, something the city has a lot more control over than the private sector. There's so many different pieces and planks that it's important to hear from candidates about the specifics of what they want to do. Not to mention things like what's going to happen with the transit network in the city. Congestion pricing might be coming. Are there ways to get city residents out of their cars more, build out more public transit, get buses moving better while also electrifying those buses? You know, a lot of nitty gritty here.
Yeah, and I think to that point, talking just not about goals, but also the means to getting there. And that's where I think you'll see a lot of separation in the candidates. For instance, I mean, we're not going to talk too much in detail because, it's early in the race and these plans are very complicated, touching a lot of different spheres of life. But just the question of how the city gets to its goals of reducing the carbon footprint, how do you finance that? How do you urge people to do that? Do you have a punitive system of fines? Do you do carbon trading that's a bit more incentive driven? Do you create new forms of financing that make it easier for the city as a whole or individual property owners or businesses to do that? That'd be something to look for too. And so, Ben, as you look at the race and the candidates, as these plans begin to come out, what are some questions that you have that you think people should answer as they discuss their approach to climate in the next term?
Well, I think one of the big ones is going back to what I just kind of got at a little bit is what are the sort of potentially big fundamental changes in life in the city that need to happen to make the city's contributions to fighting climate change more serious? And a lot of that will boil down to some of the building regulations, the energy regulations, and things related to transit. What will the next mayor do about trying to reduce cars and trucks on the city roads, improve air quality, and potentially try to get people more out of cars and build out a public transit network? What are those sort of big changes to city life that the next mayor envisions? How
I
about you?
think along with that, one of the big ones, speaking of getting people out of places, and we referenced this earlier, is the question of really vulnerable neighborhoods in the city and whether the city is going to encourage or facilitate or even force people to leave those areas. These are places that are not just going to see storm surge when there's once in a century storm, but every day high tide flooding. Increasingly, life will be very difficult there. Will the city do that? It's a topic that not every candidate broaches. It's a topic that many don't touch, even when you try to get them to. But that, I think, is a fundamental question about what life in the city is going to look like.
And one more I'll add is just this question, as the city is facing such high unemployment, the question of how quickly can a green jobs sort of program and a real green jobs vision be outlined and be implemented? And how does that relate to the ability to bring the green energy online quickly enough to replace the outdated energy and reliance on fossil fuel burning and such that folks want to get away from?
Obviously, it's a complex issue, really a complex web of issues. And as you know, there's a huge field of candidates, one by one, starting to talk more in detail about it, something to look at in close detail. And so that's why we hope you will listen to WBAI's Max and Murphy show every Wednesday at 5 p.m. And also check out citylimits.org and gothamgazette.com for details on this, the candidates, other issues, the whole race. It's your home for a detailed look at the issues New York City faces and how the 2021 candidates are talking about it.